Hi, everybody. This is Laura. Welcome, participants. So I'll get started right away. The way you display your data is important, and it has a large effect on how engaged your readers or participants are in your material. When you write a report or present, you don't want to see this. Also, the way you display your data determines how easily your readers or participants understand your material. So you don't want to see this either. What you do want to see is this. It's our job as writers and presenters to effectively display data so that our readers and participants are engaged and understand the material. This webinar is about providing some tips in using a variety of graphical tools to effectively engage your audience and to facilitate comprehension of the material. The objectives of this webinar are threefold. First off, we want to talk about data display. Why does it matter? We're going to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. And give examples of each. We're going to give overall graphic guidelines for both tables and graphics, and we're going to give tips for effective presentation. And now Sean is going to pick up with data display.
Good afternoon, everybody. I understand that you had a bit of a problem hearing Laura, so please let me know if I'm speaking too loudly or if there's any other problems. So we want to talk about data display, as we mentioned, the good and the bad and the ugly. The reason to have a good visual display of your data in reports and presentations is that it allows you to present numerical or statistical data in a time and space-saving manner. It takes advantage also of how people process information. Readers are drawn toward tables and figures because they perceive it as easy reading compared to reading a lot of text. Readers also rightly assume that these display items will provide them with a larger amount of information in a shorter span of time. But to do this well, with good graphic displays, you need to engage your participants, and you need to make your data understandable. The result of all of that, if you do it well, is you increase your audience comprehension of your findings. We're going to talk about specific tips to do this in a moment, but before we go into that, we do want to talk a bit more about the bad and, of course, the ugly. Can I get a check-in? Am I speaking loud enough? If anybody could type in yes into the chat, that would be great. Terrific, thank you. All right, the bad. What happens with a bad graphical display? Well, it's one that is not brief. It's one that is not informative. It's where not informative is where you may have too much information in a single graphic. It could be a situation where you didn't intend to be confusing, but in fact you were. And the end result is that you actually didn't add anything to the final product. We liked this little graph. We weren't sure whether he looked confused or introspective or just baffled, but we liked this graphic for this example. I'm going to talk about the ugly. We're using this diagram. The ugly is you could say that occurs when you present findings that actually distort your results or creates confusion or makes it more difficult to understand. When you're misleading, intentionally or not, we can be accused actually of lying with statistics. I'm going to talk about this particular graph. It's a very serious subject because the intent here was to show the degree of the problem of unreported sexual assault. But this actually is not an accurate representation of the issue. This actually was taken directly from an article in Slate magazine by Amanda Marcotte, who talked about 3 major issues with this infographic. And I've actually added a link in the back end of the presentation to that article if you want to read more. I'm just going to talk about the first 2. And the first issue is that the graphic assumes there's 1 rape per rapist. But the reality is that your average rapist attacks up to 6 victims. While that's difficult to capture in an infographic, it could be made clearer just by labeling the figures as rapes instead of rapists. The second major issue is the graphic overestimates the number of unreported rapes. The Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, using government numbers, estimates that 54% of rapes go unreported. I know there's a lot of debate about this, but in any event, Marcotte stated that tweaking the infographic to reflect this more conservative number wouldn't make the image less convincing, but it would make it more accurate. So let's talk a little bit more about the different types of graphics, when you should use them, and tips and best practices. Overall, our goal is to misstep the bad and try to avoid the ugly altogether. I also wanted to mention that if you have any questions during the presentation, you're welcome to type it into the chat box. Aaron is monitoring that for us, and we'll be able to let us know if you have any questions. So, statistical graphics, the goal is to show the big picture, and they're really meant to be paragraphs of data. And the truth is that these tools are best when they're constructed to convey 1 finding or 1 concept. There's a guy named Edward Tufte. I don't know if any of you heard of him. We attended one of his workshops about a year ago, and he has such a way with displaying data in an interesting, I would say, arresting manner. He has a phrase that he uses, or a quote from Edward Tufte is, "What makes for such graphical elegance?" And that's a great way to term what he does, elegance. Good design has 2 key elements. Graphical elegance is often found in simplicity of design and complexity of data. If you have a chance to see some of his work, he has these 4 beautiful books. He could take an entire season of baseball and summarize it down into 1 graph. It's just amazing. But for those of you who don't have a chance to see him, I just wanted to emphasize that this idea of simplicity and complexity are actually not completely in converse. The challenge, of course, is how do you combine simplicity of design with complexity of data? There was one website I found that said it lies in what the designers call the Squint Test. When you squint at your page so that you cannot read any of the text, do you still get something from the page? So we're not quite that ambitious. What we're talking about today is about doing effective reports and presentation graphics. And I want to talk about the fact that effective graphics actually can be more revealing than statistical tables. As we said, the objective of a graph is to show or convey the major story being revealed by the data in an unambiguous and illuminating form. Effective graphics augment or supplement, but do not duplicate your text. They only convey your essential facts. They omit visually distracting detail, and they're easy to read and understand. Graphs should not only emphasize important statistical messages and indicate relative sizes or trends, but also create reader interest in the statistics. In looking at text and graphics, it's important that text should refer to each graphic and tell the reader what to look for. The text should also only discuss the highlights of the graphic, and you need to make sure that your formats, titles, and labels should be consistent across graphics. I will confess that until I worked on this presentation, I confess that often in my reports, I say, see table such and such, and then I sort of talk about, you know, the various items in the table. And I think I'm going to take another look at my own reports and see where I can cut down on some of that text and make it a little bit more trusting of the reader, that they will actually read the table and the text. So when I'm looking at writing a report, or you're looking at writing a report, sometimes you ask yourself the question, how do you choose between a table, a figure, or text? I found this chart. Again, it was a web search. There's a link to the back, in the back of the reference section. And these are just some basic guidelines of what you might choose to do. For tables, for a table, you would use numerical values, and you want to put it into a small space. Or if you want to compare and contrast data values or characteristics among related items. You also want to talk about the presence or the absence of specific things. You would use tables when you have 10 or fewer data points, when, as I said, you have exact numeric values. And the rule of 10, the 10 or fewer, I'm not sure that's a hard and fast rule. I think some of this really is art and science. So I think you should be guided by what you think works well for you within these parameters. The next thing is to think about when to use a figure. And for figures, you're looking at trends and patterns and relationships across and between data sets. You want to summarize a research result, and you can use graphics or data plots. And or when you want to do a sequence of events, procedures, or geographical features. Schematic diagrams, images, photographs, maps would all fit well into the figure. Generally, you would also use figures when you have more than 10 data points. And again, it's to show the big picture. It's not the fine data. It's not granular. It's the big picture. I also wanted to note that the APA manual reports that suggests that reporting the results of most statistical tests, you would do that actually in the text and not in tables. And I think that's just sort of the definition of you know, these findings show that, finally, you would choose to use text when you have limited or uncomplicated data, when your table would have 2 or fewer columns, or when the data is peripheral to the study or irrelevant to the main study findings. So let's talk about some table guidelines. There's a theme here on this webinar that things should be simple, things should be self-explanatory, and that really is the critical thing. You want to make sure that what you put on your table is self-explanatory, that the reader should not have to refer to the text to understand what you're doing. The next thing is you want to divide the data. If you're presenting large amounts of information, divide the data into clear and appropriate categories. The next is they should be simple. And you want to avoid all non-data ink. That means avoiding extra lines and other items, because that can be confusing.
It actually is.
And finally, you want to make sure that you declutter and make sure there's sufficient spacing between columns and rows, and that the layout does not make the table look too messy or crowded. I'm going to show an example of a table that may be less than clear. I'm sorry. The other thing I had to talk about is we're going to avoid excessive decimals. We'll get there in a minute. So this is, I mean, I think that structurally is, sorry, one of the participants says they're having a problem with echo and bleed through from participants. So we'll fix that. Sorry about that. Anyway, this table here, although it gives some really good information, I think the problem with it is it's so dark and so difficult to really ferret out these numbers. They just all bleed together. It's really hard to see. And so when you compare that to this setup where the numbers are all very clearly delineated, you see where they're from, and it's a much cleaner, much more pleasing graphical image to look at. as I mentioned, the other thing we want to talk about is we want to keep our decimal places to a minimum. I thought this was a really interesting point. Some of this, a lot of this presentation is actually based on a presentation that was conducted at a 2006 JRSA conference, and this was one of her slides, and I had not really thought about this before, but I really like it. Keep decimal places to a minimum. They imply false precision often when they're not significant. They pad the numbers, making them look bigger than they really are. And you should really only use as many decimal places as needed to break a tie. So for an example, you have two separate tables here on the left side and the right side, and you can clearly see that the left side with 4 decimal points, which I'm not even that crazy, I never go to 4, but with 4 decimal points, you have like this seemingly granular examination of homicides of children under 5, when clearly the real message here, the bigger message, is that 68% of homicides of children under 5 are male perpetrators on male victims. I just think that with fewer decimal places, it's easier to read. And again, the issue is you just want to make sure that the numbers are different enough that decimal places are actually required. So let's talk about some of the table guidelines. Not surprisingly, we always want to make sure that we have informative titles. They should be clear. They should concisely describe the purpose or contents of the table and figure, and should ideally draw the reader's attention to what you want him or her to notice. For example, something like advantages and disadvantages of using substance abuse treatment for homeless veterans. This is a clear title. You know exactly what you're looking at. You can look at it and go, okay, I get it. But you also want to make sure that you have column heads, axis labels, figure labels, everything is clearly and appropriately labeled. And finally, you want to make sure that the information you provide in a table is not also presented in a graphic. For instance, you might want to list information such as demographics of a population in a table, or you might want to choose to present it in a pie chart, but you shouldn't do both in the same report or presentation. I actually find that sometimes I'll use a table and then use a pie chart to highlight something that it goes beyond what's in my table. But I think it's not a good idea to have duplicative efforts there. I want to talk about some graphics now. And surprise, 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 we want those to be self-explanatory as well. We're sticklers about this stuff. Simplicity and self-explanatory. You want to make sure that what you put on the table is self-explanatory. And keeping with the clarity theme, don't use abbreviations. Avoid those acronyms whenever possible. I mean, I know we're in DC and we are acronym happy, but let's try to avoid those as much as possible. We also want to write your labels from left to right and use proper grammar. And generally, don't use legends unless you're using maps. Now, here's a biggie. Scaling is really important. It's really the key to make sure that your graphic represents your data accurately and does so clearly. So I want to talk about some specific scaling guidelines. The first thing is you should include all of your data. And that really means you start with 0. Now, of course, there's always exceptions to the rule, but let's just assume that if you're talking about a topic that you've included all the data that's relevant. You also want to make sure that you have any ticks or grids or labels. They should be easy to understand. Put them in metrics that people can grasp quickly, tens, hundreds, thousands. And finally, you want to actually use as few labels as required to convey the message. Here again, I have fallen down on the job in my reports. I have a tendency to put both the percentages and the bar graphs and label everything overly. I'm an over-labeler. But I think I'm going to take another look at my work and see what I can do to change that. I think for me, the issue has been that I haven't trusted the reader to understand what I'm trying to say. And I think that might be an interesting test for yourself to say, if nobody saw the text, would they really understand what this was about? And I think that's a great sort of limited test to look at it. I want to talk next about use of scales in guidelines. I'm sorry, in graphics. So here's a figure, and to be honest, it's really not necessary to compare, to have a graphic comparing only two numbers. So if all you were reporting was the violent crime 2013-14 number, you actually wouldn't need a graphic. But the bigger problem is that both the graphics should have the same scale. And if you look at this, you see that the violent crimes are up 2.6%, but the largest increase in that was aggravated assault, which was up 5.79%. The problem is, don't they look exactly the same? I mean, it looks like the increase is exactly the same. So it's really important to make sure that you scale things in the same way, that you've been clear about what your scale is. Otherwise, it's really difficult to eyeball the magnitude of your difference. Again, there's real value, there's real elegance in keeping things simple. Too much information makes graphics hard to read. Now there is, I've seen a couple line charts that have so much interaction within the 3 lines or 4 lines that it's just a mess. And there is a statistical process called smoothing, and that's where a data set can be. You can smooth a data set to create a function that attempts to capture important patterns. This actually is beyond my capabilities in terms of presenting that information. I've never done it before, but maybe it's something we can think about for a future webinar, is to go maybe a little bit more in depth with some of these graphic examples and techniques. But for today, we're just going to talk about sort of the more basic stuff. So the smoothing, apparently is there a problem? Okay. The smoothing is a technique that can help some of those trends that are in really noisy data easier to see, but we're not going to cover that, how to do that today. The other thing, and not a surprise to anyone, we want to avoid what's called non-data ink. And I'm about to show you an example of this. Hang on a second. Sure. We're going to answer a question. That's interesting. Okay, the question is, what are your thoughts on keeping the same scale across bar charts when one has a large maximum value, e.g. 50, and the others have maximum values much lower, such as 10? Using a maximum of 50 for values of 10 would make the bars extremely small. Is there ever an instance where you would not keep the scales the same? Again, I think this is art versus, art and science together. I guess I might be tempted to take those two data points and make them, standardize them in some way, either make them a rate or something else where you can put them on the same scale. And if you don't do that, then the critical thing is to make sure you have discussed and explained why what you're displaying is different and how one should be cautious about what they're looking at. So I think, it's always a, what's the word I'm looking for, compromise. Figuring out how you want to engage your reader and your audience and make sure that you're clear. I hope that answers your questions. Yes, we have, and then Stan also points out that we have an example we're going to show up later. Oh, he's already responded. There's a small multiples also address this issue. We're going to talk about that in just a second. So, and you're welcome. So let's talk about focusing the ink on the data. Now, this is a very simple chart, and honestly, the problem with this chart is the color of the line. I printed it out in black and white, and I literally cannot see it. But so I would choose a different color line. But it's very simple. It's got a title, or rather, it doesn't have a title, which we'll talk about that in a minute too. But it's got the line, it's got the years, it's got the percentage. We're good. Simplicity. Now, here's a lot of non-data ink that it sort of makes our point. We've got those tick marks. We've got the frames. We've got this 3D line for what is really two dimensional data, and we've got all the stuff that really doesn't convey the message that you're interested in. So this kind of response to not being able to see the line is not the way to go. It's better to use a darker color or find some alternative to filling up your charts and your graphics with all this non-data ink. So I've got a little bit of a question for you all. I have a little graph here, and I'd love it if you could just via chat tell us, sort of chime in on what problem or problems do you see with this figure. We'll take a few minutes just to figure that out, and I consider this a graphic don't. So I feel like we should have Jeopardy music or something. Anyone? Okay, let's see. We've got, great. Could be labeled to save space, percent, and facility instead of each one individually. The legend is confusing. Are the bars representing the same thing? Ding, 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 ding. Snapshot of what? Population? I'm loving these answers. This is great. All right, terrific. Yes, I agree. This is a problem. There's no title. Okay, that's the first thing. We have no idea what this is about. The other thing is this, and this is a maybe personal choice, but I tend to bring all of my percentages out to the top 100%. I think it's important for you to show the true scale of something, and this only goes to 45%. But that's not even really the primary issue. For me, it's the question of, are the bars representing the same thing? And the truth is, they're not. What this is showing is, it's showing the blue lines are say the number of people that, or the percentage of prisoners that were brought in and retained on bond in August at facility 1, 2, 3, and 4, compared to the percentage of prisoners that were held on bond over the entire year at those 4 facilities in 2005. So the problem with something like this is that, when you put these 2 bars together, it really means you mean to compare them to each other. But in this case, with looking at August versus the entire year and the variety across the facility, you just don't get that message. The intent really, when you're looking at bar graphs too, you kind of want to look at, compare across bars, not necessarily within the 2 bars. So this could use a little bit of help. So this is what I consider better, but still not perfect. This, as you can see, this is by facility. This is released on bond, August 2015 versus 2015 overall. The blue is the August, what happened in August. The red is the 2015. The chart goes all the way up to 100%. Both the axes are labeled. And what we did here is that we made the year line a line so that it's distinct and separate from the bar graph. This actually displays the message. I mean, in some respects, this is interesting because it provides a context for those August numbers, but you have to really explain what this graphic is and really explain the message is that these are not the same thing. These are not comparable situations, but this is to provide a story. So I'm going to talk a little bit about just the different types of graphics, and we're going to do a lot more graphical images rather than listening to me talk, which I know you'll all be grateful for. So we have different types of graphics. They are graphs, charts, maps, drawings, photos, and you use different types of graphics depending on the kind of data that you have. So if you have continuous data, such as a scale over time, you're going to use maybe a different type of graphic than you would if you have a categorical data, which is obviously classified into discrete categories, such as race or gender. For continuous data, you want to use things like line graphs or area charts or scatter plots or maps. And so I'm going to show you some examples of some line charts and other things. Here's the small multiples we mentioned earlier. If you're kind of trying to display many things on a single chart, you could use small multiples. You can use different colors for different lines. You can use different weights or shades in black and white. You can break lines up to show one on top of the other. And you can reduce the number of lines shown to only those that you're really interested in talking about. If you have three lines or 3 data points that are exactly the same, you could simply summarize that in a footnote or some other way. So here's an example of a small multiple. We have weapons arrest rate 1965 to 92. This is by age. So we see the first chart in the upper left-hand corner is 16 years old. The next one down is 17 years old, 18 years old, 19 years old, etc. So this is just an example of what you could do if you had a number of different lines that you wanted to convey in a quick and easy fashion. Here's you could do it by the different colored lines. And again, this is the same data. You're just presenting it in one line chart versus the multiple small charts. Another graphic you could use would be the area chart. This one, actually, we only included one series, but you could use this to compare 2 or more quantities. And often, the area between the axis and the line are commonly emphasized with colors, texture, or hatchings. The next type of plot, one that I'm sure you all use a lot in looking at your data dispersion tests, is a scatter plot. This is a mathematical diagram using the Cartesian coordinates to display values for typically 2 variables for a set of data. If the points are color-coded, you could actually increase the number of display variables to 3. And each point has the value of one variable determining the position on the horizontal axis and the value of the other variable determining the position on the vertical axis. Again, it's really helpful if you're trying to determine what your data, how widely dispersed your data are. Okay, so the next kind of continuous variable graphic you can use is a map. And here, this is a map with scaled values. And I've also included in the resources, was part of the original presentation, there's a company called, or a website called colorbrewer2.org that helps you pick the proper colors for your maps. But note that they define data a little bit differently. They call continuous data sequential data. And the other variation they use is called divergent data when you have a point from which the data diverge. I put that website on the resource page. Feel free to go and play with it. But with divergent data, the idea is that you use warm colors for one side of the point and cold colors for the other side. The next set of data we want to talk about is categorical data, how you represent those in graphical images. You can use bar graphs, maps, and or diagrams. With a bar graph, and again, here's an example, it's really best for the comparison of quantities. Use a bar graph when you have a continuous variable by a categorical variable or when graphing classes such as age ranges or race or other sorts of things. You can also use either horizontal bars or vertical bars. It's really largely personal preference. But horizontal bar charts are really good in particular when your category names are long and the orientation of the chart allows the text to be placed from left to right, as most people read, thus improving the legibility of the information you're providing. They're also good when there are a large number of different categories and there is insufficient space to fit in all the columns required for a vertical bar chart across the page. I also tend to use horizontal bar charts when I'm dealing with data that select all that apply and I want to give a list, and I sort the list by bigger to smaller, and It comes out in this nice graphical image, which is very quick to note what's the most what's ever the most selected on the list. The other thing I just want to mention is that in Excel, a vertical bar chart is called a column chart, while a horizontal chart is called a bar chart. And I don't know why, but there you go. That's your tip for the day from JRSA. Okay. Again, maps, you can use that for categorical data. And they should be presented in contrasting colors. The color brewer 2 calls this type of data qualitative. So you obviously have the yellow color for those who are 17 and pink for 15, etc. So the last type of graph that I'm going to show you, or graphic, is the diagram. And one of my actual favorite diagrams is the BJS criminal history flow chart. If you all haven't seen that, it's a wonderful example of watching the flow of the criminal justice system. But here's a diagram looking at drug arrests in New York versus Washington, D.C. This is what's called a chart-like diagram, which is basically taking a collection of items and expressing the relationship between those items. And we see them all the time. So these are the types of graphics that you can use to create effective presentations. I'm going to actually turn it back over to Laura, because she's got some more tips for you on how to do effective presentation.
Hello, everyone. This is Laura, and I know that we're getting to the top of the hour. It's getting close to 3 o'clock, and we got started a little bit late, but we just have a few more things to go through, and they're interesting, so we're hoping that you'll hang on. Okay, we're going to talk about tips for effective presentation in a few different categories. We're going to talk about graphics in general, photos and icons. We're going to show a couple of examples. We're going to talk about font type. We're going to talk about callouts, which are callouts are the short bursts of text that draw attention to key points in a report. And we're also going to talk about infographics, which is really a visual presentation of information in the form of a chart, graph, or other image that combines a lot of complex information and makes it easy to understand. So let's start with graphic presentation. And the reason graphics are important in a report or a presentation is because of the way the human brain works. And humans primarily get their information about the world through their eyes. This is called the pictorial superiority effect, which essentially says that people remember pictures better than words. This effect has been demonstrated in many experiments and using many different methods. Another way of saying it is that vision dominates. And so by using graphics, you can, it's easy for your participant or reader to understand, and you can use the graphics to emphasize certain content. And you can also create a visual theme that then, if you want to repeat those graphics throughout the report or presentation, you can sort of create a visual theme throughout by doing that. So here's an example of a research report that was done by Urban Institute that uses a photograph to introduce their 2014 report on estimating the size and structure of the underground commercial sex economy in 8 major U.S. cities. And to me, this photo, which introduces the report, it's impactful, it's memorable, and it's also communicative. It sets the tone for what you're about to see in the report. And it really shows you something that would be difficult to communicate in just a few words. Another graphical way to present information is through using icons, which icons are symbols used throughout your report that organize the information. And they really provide the reader with a mental organizational structure. They facilitate quick comprehension, and they also can be repeated to reference details and also to create a visual theme. So let's look at some examples of this. Here's an example of an icon that was used in JRSA literature that I think facilitates quick comprehension, because it tells you in an instant that the information that you're seeing is national information. And then when it's used also in conjunction with state icons, it tells you immediately what information is statewide and what information is nationwide. And then if you repeat these throughout your report, it also sort of creates that sort of visual theme that we were talking about. Here's another example, also using JRSA literature. In this case, the housing report that uses icons to denote families, men, teens, and then teen girls and teen boys. And it facilitates fast comprehension as to who is being served by what agencies instead of spelling that out in text. And it also has an emotional context in that it reminds the reader that we're talking about real people. So we're going to move on to font type. And type is really the shape of individual letters and numbers that contribute to legibility in different contexts. And there's two different basic categories. Most of you know this probably, that there's serif and sans serif. And serif is a Latin word that means little feet. And the serif font is used for reading, especially in lengthy, smaller print, because the feet create an almost continual line across the bottom of a line of text that actually facilitates the reading process. Whereas sans serif is used for titles, headings, short bursts, and call-outs, or short bursts of information. I also want to note here that that many state agencies may require the use of a specific font or formatting for their reports, and so that you don't have much discretion to use different fonts. So that may be the case. Also, just as a cautionary note, beware of fonts that are too casual or childlike. People that are really into fonts say that each font has a personality of its own, and that you want to be aware of the personality that you're writing or presenting in to make sure that it coincides with what the material you're presenting. So you also want to be aware of fonts that interfere with legibility, because as we said earlier, we want your audience to be engaged as well as to make the information easier to understand. And if we're writing with an illegible font, we're not exactly doing that. Let's talk about call-outs. So call-outs are those short bursts of text that draw your attention to a key point in an article. They can be used for emphasis, and you can adjust the font, either the font size and or the color, to distinguish from the main content. Here's an example of JRSA literature that uses, you can see the United States, the national icon, and as well as a call-out, which is set aside from the rest of the text and is used for emphasis and is using a different text color. And finally, I just want to talk about the infographic. As we mentioned, the infographic. It's a relatively new term that we hear these days, referring to graphical representations of data. The infographic is a visual presentation of information in the form of a chart, graph, or other image accompanied by minimal text intended to give an easily understood overview, often of a complex subject. So if we look at an example here, here's an example from the mass transit website that shows it's doing some color coding, and it's showing in alphabetical order the different stations and different details about those stations. And while it's helpful, especially if you know exactly which station to go to, it doesn't really give you a good idea of the scope of the system. And so here's a, whoops, went too fast. Whoops. There we go. So here is an infographic that actually combines an awful lot of complicated information, but because of the design, it really is sort of simple to understand. It shows us how the different metro lines intersect with each other and where the different lines go. It also includes symbols to indicate if there's parking at the metro stop and if there are other types of transit options. Okay, we have one more, and then we go to our summary. Here's another example of an infographic, but one that is criminal justice related, and it was pulled from materials from the Sentencing Project, and it's putting into context the scale of the problem of imprisonment by gender and race in a very simple but effective way. So if we look at this, we can see that men have a much higher chance of ending up in prison than women, 1 in 9 compared to 1 in 56. And they used color and scale in this example to make their point, and I think it's really effective. Okay, so that's it for the detailed slides. I'm going to turn it back over to Sean to summarize.
Okay, so as you've already heard us say, but let's say it one last time, our goal is to highlight the data. It's to let the data lead you to the best method of your presentation. You should strive for clarity in all elements of your presentation or report. And also you need to do the work for your audience so that they can easily understand your point. Before I mention a final reference to some resources, we did get a great tip from one of our listeners who advised that given 8% of the male population is colorblind, that we should actually, instead of going with color, we should look at changes in intensity. And this person provided a link to a site, and we will add this to our presentation so that you can take a look at that as well. So lastly, I did want to talk about some additional graphical displays that you can use. And one thing that struck me for this audience in particular that might be of interest was stacking confidence intervals to get a good sense of how different results compare to one another. This is often used in meta-analysis, or you could use it to compare results of something across counties or states. I included in the resource section a link to a how-to guide about how to graphically create those and display those confidence intervals. That is it for me. I'm now going to turn this over to Erin, and thank you all for coming today.
First, I'd like to take a moment to open it up for any additional questions that anybody might have. We'll give 1 minute to allow anybody to type that in. And while I do that, I would also ask that we're going to open up the polling option here and ask people to complete the few questions that we have for you. That would be greatly appreciated. I would also like to thank Sean and Laura, as well as everyone in attendance for joining us today. We hope that you enjoyed today's presentation and will also join us for future webinars. Our upcoming webinars will include simple linear regression. That's going to be next month, and that's going to be presented by Dr. Renette Bachman from the University of Delaware. She will also be presenting in December on multiple linear regression. And then in January, we will schedule, it's not specifically scheduled, but it will be sometime in January, Sean Flower and Dan O'Connell from the University of Delaware. They will be co-presenting on logistic regression. And then we will also have one in the new year regarding exploratory data analysis. So let me go back and see if anybody has asked any questions. Give me one moment. Let's see, it looks like we may have a comment. Says, the font type that is visually helpful varies by medium. Serif fonts are difficult to read on a monitor, especially low vision and older readers. This is important when so much information is conveyed electronically and not read via print, where serif fonts can be helpful. I have to reformat almost everything, especially email. So please see, and there's another link. So we really appreciate that. I mean, and I think that, you know, gets back to the point of who's your target audience, what is the most predominant way you want people to read your report, whether it's going to be printed or electronic, and that might actually impact the font that you utilize. So thank you for those links, and we will be sure to include them in the resource section. And we will leave it open for any possible additional questions, and don't forget to complete the polling. And thank you so much, and have a good afternoon. Oh, we do have another question. Should line graphs be avoided for information that is not intended to appear as a trend?
I don't know. That's a really good question. Is there anyone in our group still online who maybe could answer that question for us? The question again is, should line graphs be avoided for information that is not intended to appear as a trend?
Hi, this is Well. We do have one comment that one individual cannot see the poll. So it does look like we are seeing people who are responding to it. So if you may not be familiar, it's a tab. It should be a tab up on the upper right-hand corner of the screen. Participants, it should be something similar to ours, I believe, participant chat polling. If you might want to try and click on one of the alternative tabs and see if that will take you to the poll. Okay, and so Stan, a colleague of ours, says that I think the lines do imply change from one point to the next, and sometimes people use them when they've plotted only points. Another participant said, I think they should be avoided. They almost always imply a trend in the audience's mind. Okay, then we have another individual, I say no to using the line graphs for anything other than trends. Otherwise, the reader may interpret a series where none exists. Okay. Thanks, guys.